April 16th, 1945. Radar Picket Station Number One, 70 miles north of Okinawa. Lieutenant Matthew Darnell gripped the fire control director aboard the destroyer USS Laffey as the first wave of 22 Japanese aircraft emerged from the morning haze. These weren't the skilled naval aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. These were tokko-tai, special attack forces, young men with perhaps 60 hours of flight training, whose mission ended not with returning to base, but with converting their aircraft into guided missiles of flesh, fuel, and explosive. Darnell armed shells containing technology, specifically designed to kill aircraft before they reached their targets. What made this morning different, what made his hands steady despite the approaching death, was the knowledge that each 5-inch shell leaving his guns carried its own miniature radar system. Variable time fuses, the Navy called them, though every gunner knew their real purpose: to transform near misses into kills, to explode automatically when they sensed an aircraft nearby, to create overlapping clouds of shrapnel that no amount of Japanese determination could penetrate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Over the next 90 minutes, Laffey would be struck by 6 kamikaze aircraft and 4 bombs. She would absorb damage that should have sent her to the bottom. But she would survive, and more importantly, her guns would destroy or assist in destroying 22 attacking aircraft. This wasn't just gunnery. This was the collision between Japanese spiritual warfare and American industrial physics, between young men trained to die and electronic devices designed to kill them before they could. The mathematics of this morning would reveal a profound historical truth, that courage, no matter how absolute, could not overcome technology, when that technology was produced by a nation that manufactured proximity fuses at a rate of 70,000 per day. October 21st, 1944. Mabalacat Airfield, Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood before a group of 23 pilots from the 201st Fighter Squadron and proposed what he termed the only way Japan might achieve victory. Conventional attacks had failed. Skilled pilots were gone, lost in the grinding attrition of the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Marianas Turkey Shoot. American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate, destroying aircraft at ranges where traditional attacks couldn't succeed. The solution, Onishi explained with careful formality, was organized suicide attacks. Pilots would load their aircraft with bombs and fly directly into American ships. The spiritual power of willing sacrifice would overcome material disadvantage. 1 aircraft, 1 ship. The mathematics seemed simple, even elegant, in a way that appealed to the Japanese military culture that had always valued spirit over materiel. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, 23 years old, married for just 3 months, volunteered to lead the first organized kamikaze unit, not from any death wish, but from a genuine belief articulated in his final letter to his wife that his sacrifice might prevent American invasion of the home islands. He understood the tactical logic. Japan no longer possessed enough skilled pilots or aircraft to win through conventional means, but suicide attacks required only enough training to keep an aircraft pointed at a target. Even minimally trained pilots could accomplish that. What neither Onishi nor Seki understood was that American ships were already deploying technology that would transform the kamikaze calculation from 1 aircraft, 1 ship, to dozens of aircraft destroyed for minimal damage. The proximity fuse had been used against conventional Japanese aircraft since January 1943, but kamikazes presented a different problem that would reveal the technology's full devastating potential. The fundamental distinction between conventional and suicide attacks was the escape phase. Traditional attackers approached targets, released weapons, and attempted to withdraw. Damage to their aircraft during approach often forced them to abort, turning away before reaching release points. This made proximity fuses devastatingly effective. Destroy or damage an aircraft at distance, and it would miss its target. Kamikaze attacks eliminated the escape phase entirely. Pilots whose aircraft were damaged continued toward targets, sometimes remaining airborne long enough to complete their missions even after sustaining hits that would have caused conventional attackers to withdraw. This created a tactical problem that proximity fuses would solve not through individual effectiveness, but through concentrated application that could destroy aircraft completely rather than merely damaging them. The kamikaze phenomenon emerged from specific historical circumstances that conventional military logic struggled to address. By October 1944, Japan had lost approximately 20,000 trained naval aviators. The men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse, who had fought over the Coral Sea and Midway, these veterans were dead or grounded by injuries. Their replacements received training measured in weeks rather than years, insufficient for the complex skills required for bombing and torpedo attacks that demanded precision timing and steady nerves under fire. Flight Petty Officer Toshio Yoshitake, typical of late-war Japanese pilots, had received exactly 63 hours of flight instruction before assignment to a kamikaze unit in December 1944. His training consisted of basic takeoff and landing, elementary navigation, and just 8 hours practicing the steep dive that would end in his death. He had never dropped a bomb, never launched a torpedo, never engaged in air-to-air combat. Such limited training would have made him useless in conventional operations, but for kamikaze attacks, it was theoretically sufficient. The word kamikaze itself, meaning divine wind, referenced typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. The military termed these attacks Shimpu Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, special attack forces, but foreign correspondents shortened it to kamikaze, and the name stuck. Pilots wore hachimaki headbands, drank ceremonial sake, received samurai swords, and departed on one-way missions with fuel calculated for outbound flight only. The ritual surrounding kamikaze operations served psychological purposes for both pilots and commanders. The ceremony transformed suicide into sacrifice, death into transcendence, defeat into potential victory. Pilots wrote final letters to families, composed death poems following centuries-old samurai traditions, and departed to songs, celebrating their heroism. The Japanese military culture that had always emphasized spirit over materiel found in kamikaze attacks the ultimate expression of that philosophy. What this culture could not accommodate was the reality that American technology had reached a point where spiritual determination became irrelevant. The proximity fuse represented not just superior engineering, but a fundamental philosophical difference between American and Japanese approaches to warfare. Americans solved problems through industrial production and scientific innovation. Japanese military doctrine emphasized human will and sacrifice. The collision between these philosophies would be measured in thousands of young Japanese lives lost for minimal strategic gain. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Lieutenant Seki led 5 fighters loaded with 250-kilogram bombs against American escort carriers off Samar. One aircraft struck the USS St. Louis, detonating aviation fuel and stored ammunition. The carrier sank within 30 minutes, vindicting Onishi's theory that suicide attacks could sink major warships. This initial success established kamikaze tactics as Japanese doctrine for the remainder of the war, but it also established unrealistic expectations. St. Louis had been lightly defended, lacked the concentrated anti-aircraft weapons of fleet carriers or battleships, and faced attackers when American fighters were engaged elsewhere. The success would prove difficult to replicate against well-defended targets equipped with proximity fuses. The technology that would doom kamikaze operations to strategic futility had been combat-tested since January 1943, though its full implications against suicide attacks wouldn't become apparent until the Philippines campaign. The proximity fuse, developed by Dr. Merle Tuve and the Section T team at the Carnegie Institution, had transformed conventional anti-aircraft effectiveness by factors of 3 to 7 depending on circumstances. Against conventional attackers, proximity fuses achieved aerial kills, requiring an average of 300 rounds compared to over 2,000 rounds for time-fused shells. This represented revolutionary improvement, but against kamikazes, the advantage would prove even more decisive. The reason lay in targeting philosophy and the fundamental nature of suicide attacks. Conventional anti-aircraft doctrine aimed to damage aircraft sufficiently to force them to abort attacks. A few shrapnel hits to engines or control surfaces would cause pilots to break off, turn away, attempt to preserve their lives and aircraft. Proximity fuses excelled at this, detonating automatically when they sensed aircraft nearby, creating fragment patterns that damaged targets at distances where time fuses would have exploded harmlessly in empty air. Kamikaze attacks removed the abort option entirely. Pilots with damaged engines continued flying on remaining power. Pilots with damaged control surfaces fought their aircraft toward targets. Pilots wounded by shrapnel maintained course through willpower until physical capability ceased. The tactical problem this created for American gunners was stark. Damage wasn't sufficient. Aircraft had to be destroyed completely, broken into pieces too small to threaten ships, before they reached their targets. The solution required not just proximity fuses, but concentrated application of them in volumes that created overlapping kill zones where no aircraft could survive. This tactical evolution occurred through bitter experience, as American ships learned that kamikaze attacks demanded different defensive procedures than conventional raids. December 18, 1944. San Pedro Bay, Philippines. Commander Frederick Beckton assumed command of USS Laffey, a newly commissioned Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer. His orders were direct. Proceed to Okinawa, take station on radar picket duty, provide early warning of Japanese air attacks against the invasion fleet. Picket duty meant positioning destroyers 50 to 70 miles from the main fleet, deliberately placing them between Japanese air bases and American carriers. Beckton understood the assignment was effectively a death sentence for many ships. Radar pickets would face the first waves of any kamikaze attack, would absorb strikes intended for carriers, would die to provide warning time for the fleet. But his ship carried advantages that earlier destroyers had lacked. Laffey mounted 6 5-inch guns, 12 40mm anti-aircraft cannons, and 11 20mm machine guns. More importantly, her magazines held proximity-fused ammunition in quantities that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The 5-inch shells, designated Mark 32 with VT fuses, had been rushed into production following the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when it became apparent that kamikaze attacks represented a new category of threat requiring maximum defensive firepower. Each shell cost $18 to manufacture, contained 130 miniaturized electronic components, and could sense aircraft at distances up to 70 feet, detonating automatically to create lethal fragment patterns covering over 3,000 square feet. Beckton drilled his gun crews relentlessly during the transit to Okinawa. The tactics he emphasized differed from conventional anti-aircraft procedures. Fire earlier, at maximum range. Don't wait for targets to close. Fire continuously, creating walls of overlapping shell bursts. Don't conserve ammunition. The proximity fuses meant that near misses killed. That volume of fire translated directly to probability of destruction. His gunners practiced on towed targets, learning the rhythms of sustained fire. The sight picture when shells detonated near aircraft. The satisfaction of watching targets disintegrate not from direct hits but from proximity-fused shells exploding nearby. By the time Laffey reached Okinawa in March 1945, her crew understood that their survival depended on destroying attackers at distances where damaged aircraft would not reach them. The tactical problem kamikazes posed was timing and geometry. A conventional attacker approaching at 300 miles per hour needed roughly 30 seconds to cover the distance from medium anti-aircraft range to bombing release point. Damage inflicted during that 30 seconds would cause most pilots to abort. But kamikaze pilots didn't abort. They flew until they died or crashed. This meant that aircraft damaged at 30 seconds distance could still reach targets, that wounding wasn't sufficient, that only complete destruction guaranteed safety. Proximity fuses solved this through earlier engagement. Time-fused shells required gunners to calculate precise detonation times, limiting effective range to distances where those calculations remained accurate. Proximity fuses removed that constraint. Gunners could engage at maximum range, 12,000 yards for 5-inch guns, confident that shells would detonate when they sensed targets, regardless of exact distance calculations. This extended the engagement envelope from 30 seconds to nearly 90 seconds, tripling the time available to destroy attackers. More critically, it meant that aircraft could be destroyed at ranges where their debris would miss targets, even if pilots had aimed perfectly before dying. The mathematics were brutal but simple. Kill kamikazes at 7,000 yards or farther, and even successful aim became irrelevant because wreckage couldn't carry that far. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. April 16th, 1945, 08:30 hours. Laffey's surface search radar detected multiple bogies inbound from the north. Combat Information Center counted them. 22 aircraft in loose formation, approaching at altitudes between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. Commander Beckton ordered general quarters. Within 90 seconds, every gun station was manned, every proximity-fused shell ready, every man understanding that the next 2 hours would determine whether they lived or died. The aircraft were tokko-tai from the 3rd Kikusui mass attack, one of 10 large-scale kamikaze operations planned to destroy the American fleet off Okinawa. Flight Petty Officer Shoichi Endo led this particular formation, 22 pilots ranging in age from 17 to 23, average flight time 62 hours, none with combat experience. They had departed Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu at 0600, flying Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters and Aichi D-3A Valdive, bombers loaded with bombs. Their briefing had been simple: locate American radar picket ships, crash into them, die for the Emperor. Endo, at 21 years old and 89 hours of flight time, was the most experienced pilot in the formation. He had volunteered for tokko duty not from fanaticism, but from pragmatic calculation. Japan was losing. Conventional attacks failed. His skill level was insufficient for bombing or torpedo attacks requiring precision, but he could fly straight, could keep his aircraft pointed at a target, could die in a way that might matter. The ritual sake that morning, the hachimaki headband, the ceremonial sword presented by his squadron commander, these things had transformed his fear into something resembling acceptance. What Endo and his fellow pilots didn't understand was that American anti-aircraft effectiveness had evolved specifically to counter their tactics. The proximity fuses that had proven devastating against conventional attackers were even more lethal against kamikazes, because suicide attacks followed predictable flight paths. Once a kamikaze committed to a target, once the pilot began his final dive, his course became essentially fixed. He couldn't evade, couldn't maneuver radically, couldn't do anything except maintain his aim. This predictability made proximity-fused shells catastrophically effective. At 0842, Laffey's 5-inch guns opened fire at 12,000 yards. Mount 51, the forward turret, fired first, Lieutenant Frank Manson calculating lead based on radar tracking data. The shell, a Mark 32 fitted with a VT fuse manufactured 3 weeks earlier at Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, travelled toward the lead aircraft at 2,600 feet per second. Inside the fuse nose, a miniature battery activated by the shell's spin-powered vacuum tubes that had been hardened to survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. The fuse transmitted radio waves at 180 MHz. As the shell approached Endo's zero, these waves reflected off the aircraft's metal structure. The reflected signal returned to the fuse's receiver with a frequency shift caused by Doppler effect, the same physics that makes train whistles change pitch as they pass. When this frequency shift reached a predetermined threshold, indicating the shell was approximately 70 feet from the aircraft, an electronic circuit closed, sending current to a detonator that exploded the shell's main charge. Endo never saw the shell. The explosion occurred 73 feet from his starboard wing, creating a fragment pattern covering 3,200 square feet. Shrapnel, travelling at 2,400 feet per second, tore through aluminum skin, severed control cables, punctured the fuel tank, and struck Endo in the right shoulder and neck. His Zero rolled inverted and began falling, but Endo was already dead, killed instantly by fragments that had entered his cockpit from the side. His wingman, Flight Seaman Second Class Masao Watanabe, 17 years old, 41 hours of flight training, watched Endo's aircraft disintegrate. He had been told American anti-aircraft fire was heavy but inaccurate, that determined pilots could penetrate it through spiritual strength. Nobody had mentioned shells that exploded without hitting anything, that killed from distances where visual aiming seemed impossible. Watanabe pushed his throttle forward, trying to close the range faster, trying to reach the destroyer before more of these impossible shells found him. Laffey's guns were firing in coordinated salvos now, all 6 5-inch mounts engaged, each gun cycling rounds every 4 seconds. The proximity fuses transformed the air around approaching aircraft into a gauntlet of overlapping explosions. Watanabe's aircraft flew into a shell burst at 8,200 yards. The explosion didn't destroy him immediately, but shrapnel severed his elevator controls and punctured his engine. Coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The Zero began losing altitude and airspeed, no longer capable of reaching Laffey, no longer a threat. Watanabe died when his aircraft struck the ocean at 300 miles per hour, creating a geyser of white water that marked another failed kamikaze attack. Aboard Laffey, Petty Officer First Class Lawrence Delevsky, gun captain on Mount 53, watched his crew's proximity-fused shells destroy 3 aircraft in 90 seconds. The killing wasn't dramatic. Aircraft simply came apart in mid-air, fragmenting into pieces too small to threaten ships, falling into the ocean thousands of yards away. Delevsky had fired time-fused ammunition during earlier actions and understood the difference. Time fuses required perfect calculations, required gunners to predict exactly where aircraft would be when shells arrived. Mistakes were inevitable. Shells exploded too early or too late. Effectiveness depended on luck as much as skill. Proximity fuses removed the luck. They detonated automatically at optimal distance. They compensated for calculation errors, for unexpected aircraft maneuvers, for the 1,000 variables that made anti-aircraft gunnery more art than science. Delevsky's mount had destroyed 8 aircraft during the morning engagement. With time fuses, he estimated they might have destroyed 2, maybe 3. The difference was survival. But proximity fuses couldn't stop everything. At 0914, a Zero piloted by Flight Petty Officer Third Class Hideo Suzuki penetrated Laffey's defensive fire. Suzuki had approached at wave-top altitude, where radar tracking was difficult, and proximity fuses sometimes detonated prematurely from ocean surface reflections. He climbed to 1,500 feet, rolled inverted, and dove toward Laffey's fantail. 5-inch shells exploded around him, shrapnel tore holes in his wings and fuselage, but the Zero continued. Suzuki fighting controls that barely responded, aiming for the destroyer's after-deck house. Commander Beckton ordered hard left rudder. Laffey heeled into the turn, but Suzuki compensated, following the destroyer's movement. 40mm and 20mm guns concentrated on the Zero, tracers converging on the diving aircraft. Proximity-fused 5-inch shells exploded in rapid sequence, each one closer than the last, shrapnel riddling Suzuki's aircraft. The Zero's engine caught fire, trailing black smoke, but Suzuki kept coming. At 09:15 and 40 seconds, Suzuki's Zero struck Laffey's port side aft, hitting between 40mm gun mounts. The 250-kilogram bomb it carried penetrated the deck and exploded in the after-crew's quarters, killing or wounding 23 men instantly. Suzuki's success demonstrated the kamikaze paradox. Proximity fuses dramatically increased the probability of destroying attackers, but against mass attacks by pilots willing to die, some would always penetrate. The mathematics weren't about stopping every attacker. They were about stopping enough attackers that ships survived. Over the next 76 minutes, Laffey faced 21 additional kamikaze attacks. 6 aircraft struck her, 4 bombs hit, her rudder jammed, fires raged, the afterdeck house was destroyed, 31 men died, 72 were wounded. By any reasonable standard, Laffey should have sunk. But proximity-fused ammunition had destroyed or assisted in destroying 16 attacking aircraft, preventing hits that would have overwhelmed damage control capability. The guns kept firing even as the ship burned, even as steering control was lost, even as wounded men remained at their stations. Flight Lieutenant Seiji Nakamura, leading the fifth wave of attacks against Laffey, witnessed what appeared to be a ship already dead in the water, burning, listing, clearly doomed. He transmitted this observation to base, reporting the successful destruction of an American destroyer, before diving toward the crippled vessel to ensure its destruction. His Val dive bomber was hit by 3 proximity-fused shells during the descent. The first damaged his engine, the second destroyed his left aileron, the third struck close enough that shrapnel killed him instantly. The Val continued its dive pilotless, passing 50 feet off Laffey's starboard side and crashing into the sea. Nakamura's assessment had been premature. Laffey survived. Damage control parties extinguished fires, emergency steering restored limited maneuverability, pumps controlled flooding. The destroyer eventually reached port under her own power, was repaired, and returned to service. But her survival depended fundamentally on proximity fuses, destroying enough attackers that she could absorb the hits that got through. Without VT-fused ammunition, naval architects estimated that Laffey would have been struck by 12 to 15 aircraft instead of 6, damage sufficient to sink her within 20 minutes of the first hit. The engagement statistics revealed proximity fuse effectiveness with brutal clarity. Laffey fired over 600 proximity-fused 5-inch shells, approximately 4,300 rounds of 40mm, and over 9,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Against 22 attacking aircraft, her guns achieved 16 confirmed or probable kills, a 73% destruction rate. Historical analysis comparing kamikaze engagements with and without proximity fuses showed this rate was typical when ammunition supply permitted sustained fire. Commander Beckton's after-action report emphasized that victory came not from marksmanship, but from volume of proximity-fused fire, creating overlapping kill zones. His gunners hadn't aimed in the traditional sense of putting crosshairs on targets. They had fired continuously, letting proximity fuses find aircraft, trusting that technology would accomplish what human skill could only approximate. This represented a philosophical shift in anti-aircraft doctrine, from precision to saturation, from marksmanship to mathematics. The Japanese perspective on this engagement came through interrogations of captured kamikaze pilots who had aborted missions due to mechanical failures. Lieutenant Junior Grade Toshimitsu Imaizumi, whose engine had failed during approach to Okinawa, described anti-aircraft fire that created an impenetrable barrier, shells that seemed to know where his aircraft was, explosions that killed pilots in adjacent positions while he watched helplessly. Imaizumi had been taught, that spiritual determination could overcome material obstacles. American anti-aircraft fire had destroyed that belief with physics that spiritual determination could not affect. The broader strategic impact of proximity fuses against kamikazes became apparent through statistical analysis conducted after the war. Between October 1944 and August 15, 1945, American naval forces engaged approximately 4,900 kamikaze sorties at Okinawa alone. Of these, approximately 2,800 aircraft were destroyed by combat air patrols before reaching ships. Of the remaining 2,100 aircraft that reached anti-aircraft range, proximity-fused gunfire destroyed approximately 1,200 before they could strike targets. The mathematics were stark. Proximity fuses achieved destruction rates of approximately 57% against kamikazes that reached gun range, compared to 19% for time-fused ammunition under comparable conditions. This meant that approximately 800 additional aircraft struck American ships, compared to what would have occurred had only time fuses been available. 800 additional hits would have increased American ship losses, from 36 vessels sunk to an estimated 70 to 90 vessels, casualties that might have delayed Okinawa operations by months. The human cost of these statistics extended beyond numbers. Each kamikaze aircraft represented a young Japanese life, average age 21, whose death achieved minimal strategic impact. Japanese commanders recognized by May 1945 that kamikaze tactics had failed to halt American advance, yet continued ordering attacks through sheer inability to conceive alternatives. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding 5th Air Fleet from caves in Kyushu, filled his diary with increasingly desperate entries, claiming victories that never occurred, imagining American carriers sunk multiple times, unable to accept that proximity fuses had made his tactics obsolete. Flight Petty Officer Takeshi Maeda, age 19, departed Chiran Air Base on May 11, 1945, flying a Ki-43 Oscar fighter loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb. His orders directed him to Radar Picket Station 15, where the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley and destroyer escort USS Evans maintained station. Maeda had written his death poem the previous evening, composed final letters to his parents and younger sister, participated in the ceremonial sake ritual that transformed his suicide into sacrifice. He believed his death would protect Japan from invasion, would honor his family, would demonstrate the spiritual superiority that Japanese military culture valued above material considerations. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, American radar tracking Maeda's aircraft from 60 miles out. Hadley and Evans prepared for what Combat Information Center designated as a mass raid, 156 aircraft inbound. Both ships increased to maximum speed, maneuvering to complicate attack runs while their gun directors calculated firing solutions. The proximity-fused ammunition in their magazines represented over 800 rounds per ship, sufficient for sustained engagement against multiple waves of attackers. Maeda approached, from the north at 12,000 feet, part of a loose formation of 37 aircraft targeting the picket station. At 18,000 yards, Hadley's 5-inch guns opened fire, proximity-fused shells creating black bursts in the pale morning sky. Maeda watched aircraft ahead of him disintegrate, confused by explosions that occurred without apparent cause, shells that killed from impossible distances. His training hadn't mentioned this, hadn't prepared him for defensive fire that found aircraft regardless of evasive action. At 12,000 yards, shell fragments struck Maeda's engine cowling, minor damage that wouldn't have caused conventional pilots to abort, but created psychological impact that Japanese military doctrine couldn't address. Maeda understood he was supposed to die, had accepted that death, but the manner of dying mattered. He wanted to crash into an American ship, wanted his sacrifice to mean something. The shells exploding around him suggested he would die. Randomly, torn apart in mid-air, his death meaningless except as another statistic. He pushed into a steeper dive, trying to reach the destroyers before proximity fuses found him. More shells burst nearby, closer now, fragments puncturing his wings, shattering his canopy. Maeda felt pain in his left arm where shrapnel had struck, felt the Oscar's controls becoming sluggish as damage accumulated. At 4,000 yards, a proximity-fused shell detonated 30 feet from his aircraft. The explosion tore away his horizontal stabilizer, sent the Oscar into an uncontrolled spin. Maeda tried to recover, tried to aim toward the destroyers, even as his aircraft tumbled. But physics overwhelmed willpower. The Oscar struck the ocean at terminal velocity, disintegrating on impact. Maeda dying instantly, his sacrifice achieving nothing. Hadley and Evans would survive the 90-minute engagement, though both ships absorbed kamikaze hits despite destroying or assisting in destroying 35 aircraft through proximity-fused fire. Hadley was struck by 3 kamikazes and 1 bomb, Evans by 2 kamikazes. Both ships were towed to port barely afloat, their survival attributed directly to VT fuses, destroying enough attackers that damage control could manage the hits that penetrated. Post-battle analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, both ships would have sunk within the first 30 minutes of the engagement. The Japanese never fully understood what killed their kamikaze pilots. Captured documents and post-war interrogations revealed that most Japanese commanders attributed increased American anti-aircraft effectiveness to superior radar fire control or increased gun densities, never suspecting that individual shells carried miniature radar systems. The technical achievement this represented seemed impossible given Japanese understanding of electronics. Japanese scientists had developed vacuum tubes, understood Doppler principles, knew the theory of proximity phases, but they lacked the industrial capacity to miniaturize components sufficiently, to harden them against gun launch forces, to mass-produce them in quantities necessary for military effectiveness. American industry manufactured proximity fuses, at rates exceeding 70,000 per day by war's end, devices containing 130 precision components, requiring coordination between 87 companies operating 110 factories. This production achievement surpassed the technical accomplishment, demonstrated industrial organization on scales that Japan couldn't approach even had their scientists solved the engineering challenges. The proximity fuse represented not just American technological superiority, but fundamental differences in industrial capability between nations. The Kamikaze campaign cost Japan approximately 3,800 pilots between October 1944 and August 15, 1945. These casualties represented virtually all remaining experienced aviators, plus thousands of partially trained replacements. In exchange, Kamikazes sank 36 American vessels, none larger than an escort carrier, damaged approximately 368 additional ships, killed approximately 4,900 American sailors. By any strategic measure, these results were insufficient to affect campaign outcomes, insufficient to halt American advance, insufficient to justify the casualties inflicted on Japanese aviation. Proximity phases alone didn't defeat kamikaze attacks. Combat air patrols destroyed more Japanese aircraft than anti-aircraft fire. Radar provided early warning that allowed fighter direction. Short-range automatic weapons engaged aircraft that penetrated 5-inch gun range. But proximity phases were the critical technology that prevented kamikaze tactics from becoming strategically significant, that kept American ship losses within acceptable limits, that allowed operations to continue, despite suicide attacks that should have been devastatingly effective. The irony was profound. Japanese commanders had conceived kamikaze tactics specifically to overcome American material advantages, to leverage the one resource Japan possessed in abundance: young men willing to die. By removing pilot survival as a constraint, by accepting that aircraft and pilots were expendable, Japanese doctrine attempted to nullify American technological superiority. But American technology had evolved to counter even suicide attacks, had developed weapons that killed pilots before they could sacrifice themselves effectively, had transformed kamikaze operations from potential game-changer into strategic futility. Flight Petty Officer Ippei Sakata, age 20, sat in his Zero fighter on the flight line at Kanoya Air Base, June 15, 1945, waiting for orders to launch on a kamikaze mission that would never occur. The war would continue another 2 months, but Japanese aviation had effectively ceased offensive operations. Proximity fuses had contributed to cumulative losses that made sustained attacks impossible. American fighters had destroyed most experienced pilots. American anti-aircraft fire, enhanced by VT fuses, had killed thousands more. The young men who remained, barely trained, equipped with obsolete aircraft, facing defenders whose technology seemed supernatural, these men could no longer affect the war's outcome even through willingness to die. Sakata would survive, would witness surrender from his airfield, would spend decades trying to explain why his sacrifice had been unnecessary, why the thousands who had died in kamikaze attacks had achieved so little. His conclusion, stated in a 1978 interview, was simple and devastating. "We were told spirit would overcome material. We believed this because we were young and taught nothing else. American technology proved this philosophy false, with machines that killed us before we could reach our targets. Our deaths meant nothing because we were fighting enemy who could manufacture shells smarter than our pilots." The proximity fuse stands in history, not merely as technological achievement, but as refutation of military philosophies that valued spirit over material, sacrifice over effectiveness, honor over results. Japanese military culture had produced warriors of extraordinary courage, young men willing to die for causes they believed transcended individual survival. American industrial culture had produced devices that killed those warriors with mechanical efficiency, that reduced courage to irrelevance, that demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare rewarded manufacturing capability more than individual heroism. Lieutenant Matthew Darnell, watching the last kamikaze fall into the sea during Laffey's April 16th engagement, understood that something fundamental had changed in human conflict. His guns had destroyed aircraft flown by pilots as brave as any warriors in history, young men who had accepted death with calm determination, who had flown toward their destruction without flinching. But bravery hadn't mattered. The shells his guns fired contained electronics that sensed targets, calculated optimal detonation distance, exploded automatically at precisely the moment when fragments would be most lethal. No amount of courage could overcome physics. No spiritual strength could deflect shrapnel traveling at 2,400 feet per second. In that morning off Okinawa, in the burning wreckage of Laffey's afterdeck house, in the bodies of American sailors killed despite their technological advantages, in the Japanese aircraft falling into the ocean thousands of yards from their targets, the future of warfare had been written. Victory would belong to nations that could innovate, manufacture, and deploy technology faster than enemies could adapt. Individual courage, tactical skill, strategic brilliance, these would remain important, but they would be insufficient without technological superiority backed by industrial capacity. The proximity fuse had killed approximately 3,000 Japanese pilots, had saved thousands of American sailors, had helped preserve ships that would support operations leading to Japanese surrender. Those 5-pound devices, each containing miniaturized electronics that seemed impossible even to the scientists who created them, had proven that free societies with industrial economies and scientific cultures could defeat totalitarian states, regardless of how willing those states' citizens were to die. The lesson was stark and would echo through subsequent conflicts. Technology trumps fanaticism, production overcomes sacrifice. Physics is indifferent to courage. The young men who died in kamikaze attacks had been as brave as warriors could be, but they had been fighting an enemy whose shells could think, and against such weapons, bravery alone could never be enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.